Something has changed in Oakland. In this episode, we look at the actual data to try and figure out what has happened to the Black people in Oakland. In 1980, the city of Oakland had approximately 159,351 Black residents, making up nearly 47% of the entire population. That wasn't a small community, that was the city. By 1990, that number was still dominant, with over 163,000 Black residents, holding roughly 44% of Oakland's population. Even as late as 2000, there were still more than 140,000 Black residents living in Oakland, making up about 35% of the city. But then something happened. This is the data they didn't show you. Today, that number has dropped to around 20% of the population. That means tens of thousands of Black residents, families, homeowners, entire communities are no longer there. So the question isn't just where did people go? The real question is, what happened to a city that was once nearly half Black and is now barely 1/5? That kind of drop doesn't happen naturally. It happens when something changes the entire structure of a city. It's suspicious and perhaps by design, and it's not natural. By 1980, Oakland stood as one of the most important Black cities in America, with nearly half of its population identifying as Black. Entire neighborhoods were shaped by families who had come west during the Great Migration and World War II, drawn by shipyard jobs, defense contracts, and the possibility of building something outside of the rigid racial hierarchy of the South. By the 1970s and 1980s, Oakland was not only culturally Black, it was politically organized and nationally recognized. It was the home of the Black Panther Party, a place where community programs, local leadership, and neighborhood identity were deeply rooted in Black power. But that foundation began to weaken long before people noticed the outcome. By 2000, the Black share of Oakland's population had already begun to decline. By 2010, the drop became more visible. And by the 2020 census, the Black population had fallen to roughly 1/5 of the city. That represents tens of thousands of people, families, homeowners, renters, business owners, no longer living in a city they helped build. That kind of shift does not happen because people simply decide to leave. It happens when staying becomes unsustainable. To understand why, it is necessary to look beyond Oakland itself and examine the economic force that reshaped the entire region. Across the Bay, Silicon Valley entered a period of explosive growth in the late 1990s and accelerated again in the 2010s. Major companies expanded rapidly, venture capital surged, and a new class of high-income earners began flooding into the Bay Area. Salaries in the tech sector far exceeded what most longtime residents in Oakland were earning, especially in communities that had historically been locked out of high-paying industries. San Francisco absorbed the first wave of that pressure. As tech workers moved into the city, rents and home prices climbed at historic rates. Longtime residents were displaced, and neighborhoods that had been stable for decades became inaccessible to the people who had lived there. But that pressure did not stop at the city's borders. It moved directly into Oakland. By the early 2010s, Oakland was being marketed by developers and investors as the next opportunity. It offered proximity to San Francisco, relatively lower housing costs at the time, and a cultural identity that had already been established. The Bay Area rapid transit system made commuting across the Bay simple, allowing higher-income workers to live in Oakland while working in San Francisco or Silicon Valley. This created a new level of demand almost overnight. Housing prices began to rise sharply. Rents followed. Properties that had once been accessible to working-class families were suddenly being priced for a completely different income bracket. Between 2010 and 2020, home values in Oakland increased dramatically, and rental costs surged alongside them. But the impact was not evenly distributed. Black residents in Oakland were far less likely to be employed in the tech sector that was driving this economic shift. National workforce data has consistently shown that Black employees make up a small percentage of the tech industry, particularly in high-paying engineering and leadership roles. That meant many Black residents were not benefiting from the influx of wealth entering the region. They were competing against it. At the same time, many Black families in Oakland did not have the same level of housing security as other groups. Decades of redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and exclusion from wealth-building programs such as the GI Bill had already limited Black home ownership and generational wealth. When the housing market began to accelerate, those historical disadvantages became immediate vulnerabilities. The 2008 foreclosure crisis made that vulnerability even more severe. Black homeowners across the country were disproportionately affected, and Oakland was no exception. Foreclosures hit historically Black neighborhoods hard, stripping away property ownership that had taken years to build. Families who lost homes were pushed back into a rental market that was becoming increasingly unaffordable. This created a chain reaction. As housing costs rose, longtime residents were forced to make decisions. Some moved voluntarily in search of more affordable living. Others were displaced through eviction or rent increases. Homeowners facing rising property taxes or financial pressures sold to investors. Entire neighborhoods began to shift as new buyers entered the market. The data shows where many of those residents went. Black households from Oakland and the greater Bay Area began relocating to cities farther inland, places like Antioch, Pittsburgh, Vallejo, Fairfield, Stockton, and Tracy. These areas offered lower housing costs, but often came with longer commutes, fewer job opportunities, and reduced access to the same public resources and community infrastructure. This pattern has been described by researchers as the suburbanization of displacement, where rising costs push lower income and historically marginalized communities out of urban centers and into surrounding regions. At the same time, Oakland itself continued to evolve. New development projects brought higher-end housing. Commercial spaces shifted to serve a different demographic. Long-standing Black-owned businesses faced rising rents and increasing competition. Cultural landmarks that once defined neighborhoods began to disappear or were repurposed. Yet the city's identity did not change as quickly as its population. Oakland continued to be associated with Black culture, its music, its history, its political legacy. Murals remained. References to past movements remained. The image of Oakland as a center of Black life remained part of its national reputation. But the people who built that reputation were becoming less visible within the city itself. This is where the conversation becomes more complex. The transformation of Oakland was not driven by a single cause. It was the result of overlapping systems, historical inequality, housing policy, economic shifts, regional development, and the rapid expansion of an industry that reshaped the entire Bay Area. The tech boom did not create these inequalities, but it accelerated them. It introduced a level of wealth that the existing housing market could not absorb without consequences. And those consequences fell hardest on communities that had the least protection. Oakland is not the only city where this has happened. San Francisco's Black population has declined sharply from its mid-20th century levels. Los Angeles has seen a significant reduction in its Black population since the 1980s. Washington, D.C., once known as Chocolate City, has experienced a similar shift as redevelopment and rising housing costs transformed entire neighborhoods and altered the city's long-standing demographic balance. In each of these places, the pattern follows a familiar trajectory. Black communities establish roots, build cultural identity, create economic ecosystems, and sustain the city through periods of disinvestment. Then, once those same areas become desirable, the cost of remaining begins to rise beyond what many longtime residents can afford. What makes Oakland distinct is not just the scale of the change, but how quickly it unfolded once multiple forces converged at the same time. Local policy decisions played a role. Development approvals, zoning changes, and the prioritization of market-rate housing over deeply affordable units accelerated the pace of transformation. While city leadership often framed growth as necessary for economic vitality, the benefits of that growth were not evenly distributed. Protections for tenants expanded over time, but many residents had already been displaced by the time stronger measures were put in place. Rent control could slow increases, but it could not reverse the loss of ownership or bring back families who had already relocated. There is also the question of wages. While the region's economy expanded, income growth for many working-class residents did not keep pace with housing costs. Service jobs, public sector roles, and small business income could not compete with the salaries coming out of the tech sector. This created a widening gap between those who could absorb rising costs and those who could not. Transportation added another layer. As more residents moved inland, commutes became longer and more expensive. Workers who once lived close to their jobs in Oakland or San Francisco were now traveling greater distances, often relying on limited transit options or facing increased fuel costs. This shift affected quality of life, access to opportunity, and the ability to remain connected to former communities. Over time, these changes reshape more than just where people live. They alter school demographics, shift political representation, and redefine which voices are most influential in local decision-making. Neighborhoods that once reflected a particular cultural and historical identity begin to reflect a different set of priorities and experiences. And yet, the narrative surrounding these changes often remains incomplete. Public discussions frequently focus on revitalization, economic growth, and urban renewal. Less attention is given to the cumulative effect of displacement, particularly for communities that have experienced repeated cycles of exclusion. The language of progress can obscure the reality that not all residents are positioned to benefit equally from that progress. In Oakland, the decline in the Black population is not simply a statistic. It reflects a broader shift in who has access to space, stability, and opportunity within the city. It raises questions about how growth is managed, who it is designed to serve, and what happens to communities that lack the resources to remain in place during periods of rapid change. The data does not suggest that Black residents disappeared without reason. It shows a pattern of movement tied closely to economic pressure, housing instability, and regional transformation. It shows relocation, not absence and adaptation under constraint. And it shows that the story of Oakland is part of a larger national pattern, one where cities continue to evolve, but not always in ways that preserve the communities that shape them. Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. Data referenced in this report draws from U.S. Census figures, regional housing assessments from the city of Oakland, and research from the Bay Area Equity Atlas, examining demographic shifts and housing trends across the region. Legal disclaimer: this content is for educational, informational, and commentary purposes. It is based on publicly available data, historical records, and research analysis. While every effort has been made to present accurate and contextual information, interpretations may vary, and viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research. And viewer discretion is advised.